Welcome to this Netcamp training video about the DHCP configuration on Huawei devices. In this lab we are using physical AR routers which are connected to each other with Ethernet connections. R1 is acting as a DHCP server and R2 and R3 are DHCP clients. We will show you two different options how to configure the DHCP server on R1. Both options will lead to the same result. Let's get started with the lab. We are on R1, which is our DHCP server, and we will first check the pre-configured interfaces. So we have the GE001, which is pointing to R3, and we have GE003, which is pointing to R2. The IP addresses are already pre-configured, so we start now configuring the DHCP service. First of all, we will need to enable the DHCP service. This can be easily done with DHCP enable. And now, as we first look at the option which is called interface based, we go into the interface, which is in this case GE003, and we will do all the DHCP configuration in the interface view. So first of all, we configure the interface-based DHCP option here on the interface. Next step, we configure the gateway, which is in our case R1. And we are going to configure some exclusions. In this lab, we are using old IP addresses from .11 up to 254. And we would have the option to configure much more options, DHCP options, but for this lab, this is enough. So that's all we have to configure. Let's jump to R2 to see if we can get an IP address. Now on R2, this should be our DHCP client. Let's see if we already have an IP address configured. That's not the case, so it will be GE003, but we don't have any IP address assigned or configured. So let's jump into the interface to configure it as DHCP client, which is done with IP address, DHCP allocation, and now it should assign an IP address from our DHCP server R1. And here we are. So we can already see here that we have assigned an IP address of 12.79, and we also have now a default route. Let's check that. So if we are still in the interface, we can easily check it with display this interface. Here we can see it's noted that the IP address is allocated by DHCP and the IP address is 10.0.12.79. And also, if we are checking the IP routing table, we see that we now have a default route pointing to R1, which is 10.0.12.1. So this one is working. Here we are back on R1, our DHCP server. We are planning now to configure the DHCP service for the connection to R3. This time we will not use the interface-based configuration. We will go for the DHCP pool option. This is done in the system view configuration. We first have to configure the DHCP pool. This is done with pool and then the name, which can be chosen. So I will use DHCP -pool in this case. Then I have to configure the network, which is 10.0.13.0 with a mask of 24. And then I will also configure a gateway, which is R1 itself with the IP address 10.0.13.1. And that is it for the pool. So we still have other options to configure if we want, but in this lab here, it's just the gateway we are configuring. Now we have to allocate this DHCP pool to the interface. So we will now jump into the interface GE001, where R3 is connected to, and we now selecting the pool. This is done with the DHCP select global. So based on the IP address configured on the interface and the pool which we have configured before, it will allocate the IP address from this range. That is it on R1. Let's jump to R3 to see if we get an IP address. On R3, we will first check if we have any IP address configured. That's not the case, so GE001 will be our interface pointing to R1. Let's configure it for DHCP. It's done with IP address DHCP allocate, and now we should see that it will also get an IP address from R1. Let's give him some seconds. Here we are. So there is an IP address of 10.0.13.61 allocated from the DHCP server, and we also have a default route now which can be checked. Let's first check the IP address with display this interface. Again, we see it's allocated by the DHCP server, and we can also check the routing table. Here we have the default route pointing to R1. To make the final test, if we have connectivity between R3 and R2, we can make a ping to R2, which is 10.0.12.79. And as we can see, we have end-to-end connectivity between R2 and R3. You also can check the DHCP allocation with the command display DHCP client. Here you see the information which are allocated by the DHCP server, so the IP address, the gateway address, and also the lease time, which is 1 day per default on Huawei devices. As you can see from the lab, the result of both options are identical, so you are free to choose whether you would like to use the interface-based configuration or the pool-based configuration.